There's a big debate in India about whether caste inequalities are a contemporary phenomenon, in the sense that are they getting reproduced in a contemporaneous way, or are they a hangover from the past? So, given that the untouchables were deeply stigmatized and kept out of the purview of education and jobs for thousands of years, or were relegated to very menial, stigmatizing caste-based occupations, if we find today gaps between caste groups that were formerly untouchable versus the upper caste who had, had decades and centuries of advantage, a question arises: is that maybe all we are seeing is really a hangover from the past, right? And that's a question that I think we can address with some evidence. And when you look at macro data, large scale data, you actually find that it's not so much a hangover of the past, because I've looked at cohorts of lower castes and upper castes and looked at critical indicators in terms of education, occupation, per capita expenditure, land ownership, and so on, and tried to see whether over time the gaps have increased or decreased, and which indicators. And I've looked at both relative gaps as well as absolute gaps, right? And what I find, and that's my work with Rajesh Ramachandran, and what we find in that research is that in elementary education, that is literacy, primary schooling, and middle schooling, caste groups have converged towards each other in the last 70 years or so after independence. And that's a good thing, and that could possibly reflect the attention that successive governments have given to the idea of primary education, right? And so, in a way, we see the impact of that in terms of convergence. But on all educational categories after middle school, so secondary education and above, we actually see a divergence between lower caste and upper caste, either a divergence or no change. So the gaps have either remained static or increased. In terms of access to white collar jobs, which are the more prestigious and the coveted jobs, again we see a divergence. Okay, if you look at average wages of those who are employed and earn a regular wage, you find in the last decade that the average wage gap has declined, right? And that seems like a welcome development. But when you look at the wage, when you break it down by the distribution of wages, you actually find that workers in the lower half of the wage distribution, below the median, you see a convergence between lower caste workers and upper caste workers. So workers that are in the lower half of the wage distribution their wages are moving towards each other over the decade. But workers that are in the top half of the wage distribution, you find actually an increase in the gap or a divergence between upper caste workers and lower caste workers, right? Similarly, when you look at the average wage gap and you decompose that into a part that is explained by wage earning characteristics like age, education, skill, etc., and the other part which remains even after you account for all of these factors, and the other part is usually taken as a proxy for labor market discrimination. We find that in the last decade, the unexplained part of the wage gap between upper caste and scheduled castes and tribes on the one hand, and upper caste and other backward classes on the other hand, OBCs on the other hand, the unexplained part, which is a proxy for labor market discrimination, is actually increased. So all critical markers of material deprivation or advantage, you find actually that caste gaps have either remained the same or have increased. And this could not happen if you thought caste was only a hangover of the past. And this also could not happen if caste were only a phenomenon that reflected itself in rural interactions. Because the share of the rural population is declining over time, over the decades, and the share of urban population is increasing. So, and even, there are studies, including my own, where we've looked at only urban populations, and we find the similar patterns. So, two things that we need to summarize this long discussion is that caste inequalities are definitely getting perpetuated in the present in present day labor markets. And caste discrimination is a phenomenon characteristic of the present, not only a hangover from the past. And caste discrimination is a phenomenon that is not only a rural phenomenon, but is very much perpetuated in the urban economy.